There is a moment in the long story of human warfare, not a battle, not a treaty, not the death of a king, but a single morning on a quiet stretch of water, when everything that had come before it became, almost without ceremony, obsolete. The wooden warship had ruled the seas for 3,000 years. Think of that for a moment. 3,000 years of pine and oak and cedar, of pitch and rope and canvas. Fleets that carried the ambitions of Rome, of Byzantium, of England, of Spain. Ships that had crossed uncharted oceans, broken the power of empires, and decided the fates of continents. The sailing warship, at the height of its perfection, was one of the most complex machines human civilization had ever produced. A living, breathing instrument of war and navigation, crewed by hundreds of men who knew its every mood, its every creak and sigh in a rising sea. And then, in the span of a single afternoon in March of 1862, on the shallow grey waters of Hampton Roads, Virginia, all of that was swept aside. What did it was not a larger ship, not a faster ship, not a ship with more guns or more men. What did it was something barely recognizable as a ship at all. A low, dark, almost featureless shape that moved through the water with the unhurried certainty of something that could not be stopped. Cannonballs struck its sides and fell away. Shells burst against it and did nothing. The men inside it hardly flinched. It was iron, and the world would never be the same. The idea of armoring a vessel in metal was not, strictly speaking, new. The ancient Koreans had experimented with iron plating on their famous turtle ships in the late 16th century, vessels that helped repel the Japanese invasions under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, low and covered and bristling, looking less like a warship and more like something a blacksmith had dreamed up in a fever. But these were coastal craft, built for a single purpose in a single conflict, and their influence for a time did not travel far. It was the Industrial Revolution that made the ironclad truly possible, and perhaps inevitable. As the 19th century matured, the world's great powers found themselves in possession of something previous generations had never had: the ability to manufacture iron in sheets, in vast quantities, at a cost that made it practical not merely for tools and bridges and railways, but for ships. Great ships, fighting ships. The French were first, as they so often were in matters of naval innovation. In 1859, the Gloire slipped into the water at Toulon. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. A wooden-hulled vessel clad in 4.5 inches of wrought iron armor. She was not beautiful, not in the way a ship of the line under full sail was beautiful, but she was something more important than beautiful. She was something that existing navies had no answer for. The British, alarmed, responded within 2 years with HMS Warrior, and here the ironclad took a great leap forward. Where the Gloire was iron plating on a wooden frame, Warrior was iron through and through. Her hull, her decks, her very bones were metal. She was, at the time of her launching, the most powerful warship on the face of the earth. Nothing afloat could hurt her. Nothing afloat could outrun her. And yet, the true reckoning, the moment the world truly understood what it had built, was still to come. That reckoning arrived in America, in the middle of a civil war, on a morning when the Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia, rebuilt from the captured hull of the USS Merrimack, steamed into Hampton Roads and methodically destroyed the wooden Union fleet anchored there. She sank the USS Cumberland. She burned the USS Congress. She did it slowly, calmly, unhurriedly, as though the broadsides of the Union warships were nothing more than rain against a window. One eyewitness wrote that watching the cannonballs bounce off her iron sides was like throwing pebbles at a barn door. The next morning, the Union's own ironclad arrived, the USS Monitor. a vessel so strange in its appearance that Confederate sailors reportedly mistook it for a raft with a cheese box on top. For 4 hours, the two iron ships hammered each other at close range in the first battle between armored vessels in history. Neither sank, neither surrendered. But when the smoke cleared over Hampton Roads, every admiral in the world understood something that could not be ununderstood. The age of the wooden warship was over. What follows is the story of that age, how it ended, and what rose in its place. It is the story of engineers and admirals, of visionaries and skeptics, of men who built ships unlike anything the world had seen, and sent them into battles that rewrote the rules of naval warfare. It is the story of the Ironclad, where it came from, what it could do, and why, for one remarkable span of decades, it stood as the most formidable instrument of war that sailed any ocean on Earth. Settle in. The water is calm, and the story is a long and extraordinary one. There is something quietly remarkable about the way great technological revolutions so often begin not with a single genius working alone in a lamplit room, but with a slow, almost imperceptible accumulation of pressure, the weight of necessity, of rivalry, of new materials arriving in the world at precisely the moment when somewhere finally has the courage to ask the question that changes everything. For the Ironclad warship, that question was simple, almost embarrassingly so. If iron can stop a bullet on land, if it can protect a locomotive, a bridge, a bank vault, why then can it not protect a ship? The answer, for most of naval history, had been equally simple. Iron, in sufficient quantities to armor a warship, was too heavy. A wooden ship of the line already carried an almost impossible burden of guns and provisions, and men and rigging. Add iron plating to its sides, and it would sit so deep in the water as to be useless, sluggish, unsteerable, a floating target rather than a fighting vessel. The physics for centuries simply did not cooperate. What changed was not the physics. What changed was everything else. By the middle of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had fundamentally altered what was possible. Rolling mills, vast, thundering machines that could take molten iron and press it into flat sheets of consistent thickness and extraordinary strength, had become a fixture of the great industrial cities of Britain, France, and America. The same processes that were laying railway tracks across continents could now produce armor plating in quantities that would have been unimaginable to a shipwright of even 50 years earlier. At the same time, the steam engine had solved the Ironclad's other great problem, propulsion. A wooden sailing ship depended on the wind. It was fast and nimble when the wind favored it, and helpless when it did not. An iron ship, heavy and low in the water, with its masts reduced or removed entirely, needed no wind. Its engines, great, churning, coal-fired pistons deep in its hull, drove it wherever its captain directed, regardless of the weather, regardless of the tide, regardless of the season. The Ironclad was the first truly reliable warship. It would go where it was told to go, and it would go there at a speed of its own choosing. This was a revolution within a revolution, and the men who grasped it earliest gained an advantage that, in the ruthless competition of 19th century naval power, was worth more than any number of older, prettier vessels. The construction of an ironclad was a process unlike anything shipyards had previously attempted, and the yards themselves had to be reimagined almost from the ground up to accommodate it. A traditional wooden warship was built by craftsmen, carpenters, caulkers, riggers, men whose skills had been passed down through apprenticeships stretching back generations. They worked with adze and mallet and draw knife, shaping timbers that had been selected years in advance for the precise curve of their grain. It was intimate, almost organic work. Each ship was, in a meaningful sense, handmade. An ironclad was built by industry, The process began not in a shipyard, but in a foundry or rolling mill, where iron ore was smelted and purified and pressed into plates. Each one tested for strength, for consistency, for the absence of the microscopic flaws that could cause a plate to crack under impact rather than absorb it. The plates were then transported, by rail, by barge, by the groaning effort of horse-drawn carts, to the yard, where a workforce that combined traditional shipwrights with a new breed of industrial workers set about the extraordinary task of assembly. The frame of an ironclad was iron itself, great ribs of wrought iron rising from an iron keel, bolted and riveted together with a precision that wooden construction could never quite achieve. Riveting, in particular, was an art form of the industrial age, teams of 4 men working together, one heating the rivets in a portable forge until they glowed cherry red, one catching them in a bucket, one holding a backing iron against the far side of the plates, and one driving the rivet home with a hammer. Could fix hundreds of joints in a single working day, each one forming a seal that grew tighter as the metal cooled and contracted. The sound of a working ironclad yard was something visitors described for decades afterward, a continuous, rhythmic thunder of hammers ringing out across the water from dawn until dark. The armor plating itself was bolted over this iron skeleton in overlapping layers, angled where possible to encourage cannonballs to glance rather than strike squarely. Early ironclads typically carried between 4 and 6 inches of wrought iron on their most vulnerable surfaces. Later designs, as naval guns grew more powerful and the grim competition between armor and armament accelerated, would push that figure considerably higher. Some vessels of the 1870s and 1880s carried over 2 feet of compound armor on their main belt, a thickness that gave them an almost geological solidity. Below the waterline, engineers worked to solve a problem that iron itself created. Unlike wood, iron did not float. The buoyancy of an ironclad was achieved through careful compartmentalization, the interior of the hull divided into watertight sections by iron bulkheads, so that even if one section were flooded in battle, the ship as a whole would remain afloat. This was a concept so sensible, so obviously correct, that it seems almost strange it had not been standard practice before. But the wooden ship had always relied on its material, wood floats, rather than its architecture. The ironclad, by contrast, had to be designed to survive. Every decision, from the placement of bulkheads to the angle of the armor, was a deliberate engineering choice rather than a tradition inherited from the past. The men who made these choices were a new kind of professional, the naval architect and the marine engineer, and they operated in a world that was changing faster than any framework for understanding it had been established. In Britain, the figure who loomed largest in this transformation was Edward Reed, the chief constructor of the Royal Navy from 1863. A self-taught engineer of formidable intelligence who approached the design of warships with the rigorous, almost cold-blooded logic of a mathematician. Reed understood, earlier than most, that the ironclad was not simply a wooden warship with a coat of metal. It was an entirely different kind of vessel, operating under entirely different principles, and it deserved to be designed as such from the keel upward. His ships, HMS Bellerophon, HMS Hercules, HMS Devastation, were each in their own way a statement of what serious, disciplined engineering could achieve. Devastation, launched in 1871, carried no sails at all, making her the first ocean-going, mastless turret warship in the Royal Navy's history. She was, to eyes accustomed to the graceful spread of canvas that had defined warships for centuries, almost aggressively ugly. She was also, in every meaningful sense, the future. In America, the genius of the moment was John Ericsson, a Swedish-born engineer of almost supernatural inventiveness, who had already transformed the screw propeller before he turned his attention to warship design. Ericsson's Monitor, designed and built in a breathtaking 100 days, introduced the revolving turret, a cylindrical armored housing mounted on the deck that could rotate to bring its guns to bear in any direction without the ship itself needing to turn. This was an idea of profound importance. The broadside, the fixed row of guns running the length of a ship's hull, requiring the entire vessel to be maneuvered to aim, had been the fundamental weapons arrangement of naval warfare for 300 years. The revolving turret made it unnecessary. A ship needed only 2 guns if they were in a turret that could face any direction. Ericsson had, in a single insight, rendered obsolete not just a tradition but an entire philosophy of naval gunnery. The turret was not without its problems. Early versions were difficult to rotate under fire, vulnerable at the base where they met the deck, and the low freeboard of vessels like Monitor, that characteristic barely above water profile that made them look so extraordinary and so strange, made them dangerously susceptible to flooding in rough open seas. Monitor herself was lost in a storm off Cape Hatteras on the last night of December 1862, taking 16 of her crew with her. The sea, it turned out, was a more patient enemy than any Confederate ironclad, but the turret survived and improved, and within a decade it had become the standard arrangement for the most powerful warships in the world. The broadside ironclad, the direct descendant of the ship of the line, just clad in iron rather than oak, gave way to the turret ship, the barbette ship, the pre-dreadnought battleship, each generation more powerful, more sophisticated, and more thoroughly removed from anything that a sailor of the Napoleonic era would have recognized. The wooden warship had not merely been replaced. It had been made into a different category of thing, entirely. A relic, a museum piece, a beautiful ghost. The men in the rolling mills and the foundries and the drawing offices of the 1860s had not set out to end an age. They had simply followed the logic of their materials, one rivet at a time, until the age ended on its own. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a body of water just before a naval battle. Sailors who survived such moments wrote about it with a consistency that suggests it was not merely personal, not simply the quieting of one man's nerves, but something atmospheric, something almost consensual, as though the water itself understood what was about to happen and chose, for a moment, to hold its breath. On the morning of the 8th of March 1862, that silence lay over Hampton Roads, Virginia, a broad, sheltered stretch of water where the James and Elizabeth rivers emptied themselves into the Chesapeake Bay. The Union fleet anchored there was large, well-armed, and entirely confident. Its ships were among the finest wooden warships the United States Navy possessed. The Cumberland, a sloop of war carrying 24 guns. The Congress, a 50-gun frigate. The Minnesota, a large and powerful steam frigate that represented the very best of conventional naval construction. Their crews were experienced. Their guns were loaded. They had every reason by any established measure of naval power to feel secure. What came at them from the direction of the Elizabeth River that morning gave them every reason to feel otherwise. The CSS Virginia had begun her life as the USS Merrimack, a United States Navy steam frigate scuttled and burned by retreating Union forces when Confederate troops seized the Norfolk Navy Yard in April of 1861. The Confederacy, acutely aware that it could not compete with the Union's industrial capacity in conventional shipbuilding, had raised her charred hull from the river bottom and set about transforming her into something the world had never seen. What emerged from that transformation defied easy description. Her upper works had been replaced by a sloping iron casemate, a heavily armored superstructure angled at 35 degrees so that incoming fire would tend to glance upward rather than strike flat. The casemate was plated with 2 layers of 2-inch wrought iron rolled at the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, one of the few facilities in the Confederacy capable of producing such material. She carried 10 guns. She was slow, desperately, almost comically slow, capable of barely 5 knots in favorable conditions, and requiring half a mile simply to turn around. Her engines were the same damaged, unreliable machinery salvaged from the Merrimack's original hull, and they threatened at various moments throughout her short career to fail entirely. None of it mattered, because she was iron and the ships waiting for her in Hampton Roads were wood. The Virginia's approach that afternoon was so leisurely, so unhurried, that Union sailors initially assumed she was simply a vessel moving through the roads on some ordinary errand. It was only when she altered course directly toward the Cumberland that the alarm was raised. And by then, there was very little time for what that alarm might have accomplished. The Cumberland opened fire first. So did the Congress and the shore batteries and every gun that could be brought to bear from the Union fleet. The Virginia steamed through it all without apparent concern. Shells burst against her iron casemate and fell into the water. Solid shot struck her sloping sides and deflected upward in showers of sparks. Her crew inside the casemate heard the impacts as a continuous, enormous ringing, like being trapped inside a bell while someone struck it repeatedly with a locomotive. She returned fire as she came, and her fire was not deflected. Her shells tore through the wooden sides of the Cumberland as though they were paper. She drove her iron ram into the Cumberland's hull below the waterline, opening a hole through which the sea rushed in with a finality that no amount of courage or seamanship could address. The Cumberland went down with her flag still flying. Her crew, in one of the most celebrated acts of defiance in American naval history, continuing to fire her guns even as the water rose around them, even as the gun deck flooded, firing until the muzzles themselves were submerged and the ship settled on the bottom with her colors still above the surface. The Congress, unable to maneuver into deeper water and aground on a shoal, surrendered after a prolonged and terrible exchange. The Minnesota ran aground, attempting to come to the aid of her consorts. By the time darkness fell over Hampton Roads, the Confederate Ironclad had sunk one Union warship, forced the surrender of another, and damaged or disabled several more, all without losing a single man to enemy fire. It was the most devastating single day for the United States Navy in the entire 19th century. In Washington, the news caused something approaching panic. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton reportedly paced the room during an emergency cabinet meeting, pausing at the windows to look anxiously at the Potomac River, convinced the Virginia would steam up it and shell the Capitol into submission. Abraham Lincoln, characteristically, was calmer. He had reason to be, because even as the Virginia was conducting her methodical destruction of the Union fleet, something was already on its way to meet her. The USS Monitor arrived at Hampton Roads in the early hours of the 9th of March, having made the journey down the coast in conditions that nearly sank her before she ever reached the battle. She was extraordinary to look at, or rather, extraordinary to puzzle over, because she barely looked like a ship at all. Her hull was flat and low, her deck just 18 inches above the waterline, so that from a distance she appeared to be simply a metal raft. On that deck sat a single cylindrical turret, 9 feet high and 20 feet across, armored with 8 inches of iron and housing, 2 11-inch Dahlgren guns. She was designed by a man who had thought very carefully about what a warship actually needed to do, and had discarded everything that was traditional, simply because it was traditional. No broadside, no masts, no towering freeboard, just armor, guns, and engines arranged with the ruthless efficiency of an engineer who had no patience for ornament. The battle that followed the next morning lasted 4 hours. The two vessels circled each other at distances sometimes close enough for the crews to have exchanged conversation. Had the thunder of their guns permitted any conversation at all. The Virginia attempted to ram the Monitor as she had rammed the Cumberland, but the Monitor's shallow draft allowed her to evade with a nimbleness her larger opponent could not match. The Monitor's turret rotated steadily, bringing her guns to bear regardless of her heading. The Virginia's guns struck the turret repeatedly and failed to penetrate it. The Monitor's guns struck the Virginia's casemate repeatedly and failed to penetrate that. It was, in the most literal sense, an inconclusive battle. Neither ship was sunk, neither surrendered. When the smoke finally cleared and the two ironclads drew apart, the tactical result was essentially a draw. but the strategic implications were seismic, and they were felt not merely in Virginia, but in every naval ministry and admiralty in the industrialized world. Within days of the battle, Britain ordered a suspension of further construction of wooden warships. France followed. The wooden warship of the line was officially, irrevocably finished. Hampton Roads was the most famous ironclad battle in history, but it was far from the only one. The years that followed produced engagements on rivers and in harbors, and on open seas that further refined, and sometimes violently tested, everything the engineers believed they had achieved. On the rivers of the American interior, the war produced a fleet of ironclad gunboats that were in many ways as consequential as the ocean-going vessels. The City-class gunboats, squat, turtle-backed, lightly armored vessels built with extraordinary speed by the engineer James Eads, helped Ulysses Grant crack open the Confederate interior along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. The fall of Fort Henry in February 1862 was accomplished almost entirely by the guns of Flag Officer Andrew Foote's ironclad fleet, the fort's garrison surrendering to the Navy before Grant's infantry had even arrived on the field. The rivers, it turned out, were highways for iron as much as for commerce. In South America, a conflict that many in the wider world barely noticed produced what some naval historians consider the most ferocious ironclad battle ever fought. The War of the Pacific, which set Chile against the combined forces of Peru and Bolivia beginning in 1879, saw ironclad warships meet in open ocean combat with a violence and at a range that the sheltered waters of Hampton Roads had never permitted. The Battle of Iquique in May of 1879 produced one of the great acts of desperate heroism in naval history, when the Peruvian wooden corvette Independencia and the monitor Huáscar, a Peruvian turret ship that became the most storied individual warship of the entire ironclad era, engaged the Chilean fleet in a fight that was as unequal in its technology as Hampton Roads had been, and as extraordinary in its human drama. The Huáscar, under the command of Admiral Miguel Grau, conducted a 3-month campaign against the Chilean Navy that combined tactical brilliance with a chivalric decency toward defeated enemies that Grau's opponents openly admired, even as they hunted him. When he was finally brought to battle at Angamos in October of 1879 and overwhelmed by superior Chilean ironclads, the loss was mourned on both sides of the conflict. He had shown what one determined man in one iron ship could accomplish against all reasonable expectation. The ironclad, it had become clear, was not merely a weapons platform. In the hands of the right commander, it was a statement about will, about ingenuity, about the refusal to accept the verdict that numbers and weight of metal seemed to have already delivered. The sea had always rewarded such refusals. It continued to do so now. There is a romance to piracy that history has never quite managed to shake. And history, to be fair, has not always tried very hard. The golden age of piracy, that extraordinary, chaotic, morally complicated flourishing of maritime outlawry that ran roughly from the 1650s to the 1730s, has left an impression on the popular imagination so vivid and so durable that it has survived 3 centuries of debunking, contextualizing, and revisionism almost entirely intact. We know the names, we know the flags, we know the stories, or the versions of the stories that have been passed down through novels and paintings and, eventually, films. Blackbeard in the harbor at Nassau, Bartholomew Roberts flying his elaborate personal banner over the slave coasts of West Africa, Anne Bonny standing at the rail of a captured sloop, with a cutlass in each hand, which is almost certainly not true, and which no one particularly wants to stop believing. What is less often told, and what is in many ways the more interesting story, is how that age ended. Not with a famous battle, not with the hanging of a celebrated captain, but with the slow, grinding, inexorable pressure of exactly the kind of technological and institutional change that the ironclad represented. And when the ironclad arrived, it did not merely make piracy more difficult, it made the entire logic of piracy, The logic that had sustained it for centuries simply ceased to function. To understand why, it is necessary to understand what piracy had always required in order to survive. A pirate vessel, at its most basic, needed three things. It needed speed to overtake its prey and, when necessary, to escape its pursuers. It needed shallow water access, the ability to retreat into harbors, rivers, and coastal shallows where the deep-drafted warships of state navies could not follow. And it needed a certain rough equality of armament with the merchant vessels it preyed upon. Not superiority necessarily, but enough guns to make resistance seem more costly than compliance. For most of the golden age of piracy, all three of these requirements were easily met. The fast, shallow-drafted sloops and brigantines favored by Caribbean pirates could outrun almost any naval vessel in a fair wind, and could duck into the labyrinthine coastal geography of the Bahamas, the Carolina Banks, or the Gulf of Mexico with a confidence born of intimate local knowledge. The merchant ships they hunted were lightly armed and crewed by men who were sailors and tradesmen rather than fighters. The navies hunting them were powerful but spread thin. The Atlantic was enormous, the coastlines intricate, and the resources of even the greatest maritime powers were never quite equal to the task of policing every cove and inlet where a pirate sloop might find shelter. This balance, fragile, shifting, always contested, but genuinely a balance, persisted in various forms well beyond the classical Golden Age. True piracy declined significantly after the 1730s, but its successor forms, privateering, coastal raiding, the activities of the so-called pirates of the Mediterranean and the South China Sea, retained the same essential structure. Speed, shallow water, rough parity of weapons. The formula worked because the naval technology available to states was not categorically different from the technology available to independent maritime actors. A sloop was a sloop. A cannon was a cannon. The gap between a pirate vessel and a naval frigate was a gap of size and resources, not of fundamental kind. The ironclad changed the fundamental kind. Consider what an ironclad represented to a pirate or a coastal raider attempting to apply the old logic to the new reality. Speed was no longer a reliable refuge. The early ironclads were not fast vessels. The Virginia's 5 knots was almost leisurely. But speed in this context was not the point. What mattered was that the ironclad was powered by steam, and steam was not dependent on the wind. A pirate sloop becalmed in a flat sea had always been vulnerable. Now, a vessel that was never becalmed, that moved at a steady and reliable speed regardless of weather, that could pursue a fleeing ship through conditions that would have stopped a sailing warship entirely, that was a different proposition altogether. The great equalizer of the open sea, the wind, had been removed from the equation. Shallow water access, for centuries the pirates' most reliable escape route, was also increasingly challenged. The ironclad gunboats that patrolled the American river systems during the Civil War, the city-class vessels, the Eads gunboats, the peculiar assortment of converted ferries and river steamers that found themselves pressed into armored service, were specifically designed to operate in shallow, confined waters. The delta, the estuary, the river mouth. These were no longer sanctuaries. They were, if anything, hunting grounds. Places where a shallow-drafted gunboat could pursue a fleeing vessel into waters where there was no room to maneuver and no possibility of escape. And the parity of armament, that rough, functional equality that had made resistance or deterrence at least conceivable, was simply gone. There was no cannon available to a pirate vessel. No gun of any practical size that could be mounted on a fast coastal raider that would do anything meaningful to an armored warship. The shells would bounce. The solid shot would glance away. The vessel inside the armor would continue its approach at the same unhurried pace, entirely indifferent to anything thrown at it. And when it chose to reply, its reply would be devastating and final. The pirate's essential bargain. "I can hurt you, so let us come to an arrangement," had been revoked without negotiation. This transformation played out most visibly not in the Caribbean, where classical piracy had already been largely suppressed, but in the waters of East and Southeast Asia, where maritime raiding had been a persistent feature of coastal life for centuries, embedded in local economies, patronized by local rulers, and extraordinarily difficult for European colonial powers to eradicate by conventional means. The pirates of the South China Sea and the Malay Archipelago were not romantic figures in the European mold. They were, in many cases, sophisticated commercial and military operations, fleets of fast proas and war junks, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, capable of descending on a coastal settlement or a merchant vessel with a speed and violence that European administrators found genuinely alarming. The Spanish in the Philippines, the Dutch in the East Indies, the British in the Straits of Malacca. All had spent decades and considerable treasure attempting to suppress raiding fleets that seemed, like water, to simply flow around whatever obstacle was placed in their path. The introduction of steam-powered gunboats in the 1840s began to shift this balance, and the arrival of armored vessels accelerated the process with a finality that no previous naval technology had achieved. The shallow-drafted steam-powered gunboat could follow a raiding proa into the river mouth. The armored vessel could shrug off the broadside of a war junk and continue its approach. The combination of reach, reliability, and invulnerability that iron and steam provided was, in the context of suppressing maritime raiding, almost perfectly suited to the task. The Rajah of Sarawak, James Brooke, one of the more extraordinary figures of the Victorian colonial world, conducted a series of campaigns against the Iban and Ilanan pirates of Borneo in the 1840s and 1850s that demonstrated exactly this principle. Brooke's vessels were not yet true ironclads, but they were steam-powered, and that alone was often sufficient. The Battle of Batang Maru in 1849, in which a combined British and Sarawak force destroyed a vast raiding fleet, was decisive not because of superior numbers — the raiding fleet was much larger — but because the steam-powered vessels could maneuver freely in the confined river channels regardless of the wind, pursuing and engaging the proas with a persistence that sailing warships could never have sustained. When true armored gunboats followed in subsequent decades, the calculation became still more lopsided. By the 1870s and 1880s, the great raiding cultures of the South China Sea had been suppressed. Not entirely, not permanently, but reduced from a serious strategic threat to a persistent nuisance, and that reduction was in large measure the work of iron and steam. There is something genuinely melancholy about this history, if one allows oneself to feel it, not because piracy was good. It was not, and its human cost was enormous, paid largely by the ordinary sailors and coastal villagers who bore the violence of it most directly, but because the world that produced it, the world of the independent sea rover, operating in the spaces between state power, living or dying by speed and cunning and the fickle favor of the wind, was a world of a particular kind of freedom, however brutal, and that world closed quickly and completely when the iron ships came. The sea had always been a place where the rules of the land applied imperfectly, where authority thinned with distance from the coast, where a fast ship and a willing crew could find a kind of liberty that no landlocked society permitted. The ironclad was, among many other things, the instrument by which that liberty was foreclosed. It brought the state's monopoly on organized violence out onto the open water and made it stick in a way it never quite had before. The last pirates did not go out in a blaze of romantic glory. They were hunted into shallows that no longer sheltered them, by ships that no longer feared their guns, until there was nowhere left to run and nothing left to threaten. The iron shore had come to meet them, and it did not yield. There is a particular kind of anxiety that grips great powers when they suspect, even for a moment, that a rival has found something they have not. It is not quite fear, though fear is part of it. It is something more restless than fear. A driven, compulsive energy that does not permit stillness, that reads every report from every foreign shipyard with the intensity of a man deciphering a ransom note. The naval arms race that the Ironclad ignited in the 1860s was powered by exactly this energy, and it burned for half a century with an intensity that reshaped not merely the world's navies but the industrial economies, the foreign policies, and ultimately the fates of the great empires that fed it. It began, as so many things in the 19th century began, with Britain and France watching each other very carefully across the English Channel. The French Gloire had alarmed the British in 1859, and HMS Warrior had been the response. A response so emphatic, so thoroughly superior in every measurable dimension, that it might have been expected to settle the matter for a generation. It did not, because the nature of the Ironclad competition was not simply a competition between existing ships. It was a competition between ideas, between design philosophies, between the visions of engineers who were still learning, with every ship they built, what an ironclad actually was and what it could become. And in that kind of competition, today's answer is always tomorrow's question. Warrior was the finest warship in the world in 1861. By 1866, she was already considered obsolescent, not because she had deteriorated, but because the world around her had moved so rapidly that she had been left behind by her own successors. The guns that had been unable to penetrate her armor when she was launched had been redesigned and enlarged until they could. The broadside arrangement that had seemed so powerful had been rendered inefficient by the development of the rotating turret. The rigging she still carried, a concession to the conservative instincts of a navy that was not yet quite ready to trust steam alone, marked her as a vessel caught between two ages. This was the central drama of the ironclad era. The warship was evolving faster than any single generation of ships could keep pace with. Every design that entered the water was, in some respect, already being superseded on the drawing boards of the men who had built it. The competition between armor and armament, the eternal question of whether the gun or the plate would have the upper hand, drove both forward in a relentless, mutually accelerating spiral that consumed resources on a scale that previous centuries would have found incomprehensible. The guns, in particular, grew with a speed and to a scale that contemporaries found almost surreal. The cannon of the age of sail had been measured in the weight of the iron ball it fired. A 12-pounder, a 32-pounder, the massive 68-pounder carronade that was the heaviest practical naval gun of the Napoleonic era. These were weapons a man could stand beside without feeling physically diminished by them. The guns of the ironclad era were something else entirely. Armstrong, Krupp, Woolwich, the great armaments manufacturers of Britain and Germany, produced guns in the 1870s and 1880s that fired projectiles weighing not pounds but hundreds of pounds, propelled by charges of powder that had to be rammed home by mechanical means because no human crew could manage them unaided. The Royal Navy's Woolwich guns of the early 1870s fired a 400-pound shell. By the 1880s, guns were in service that threw projectiles of 1,700 pounds or more, at velocities sufficient to penetrate 2 feet of iron plate at combat ranges. The barrel of such a weapon was longer than many of the wooden ships of the line that Nelson had commanded at Trafalgar. The armor that responded to these guns grew in corresponding proportion, and the materials of which it was made grew correspondingly sophisticated. Early wrought iron plate gave way to compound armor, a sandwich of hard steel face hardened by rapid quenching bonded to a tough wrought iron backing, which gave way in turn to Harvey armor, and then to Krupp cemented armor, each generation harder and more resistant to penetration than the last. The science of metallurgy and the science of ballistics advanced together, each feeding the other, each requiring new industrial processes, new testing facilities, new theoretical frameworks that barely existed before the ironclad made them necessary. The naval proving grounds of the period. Shoeburyness in England, Spezia in Italy, were among the strangest landscapes the industrial age produced. Enormous plates of armor, mounted at carefully calculated angles, fired upon by the largest guns that could be transported to the site. The results measured and recorded and analyzed with a precision that would not have been out of place in a scientific laboratory, which, in a meaningful sense, is precisely what they were. In the midst of this technical ferment, the great powers watched each other with undiminished anxiety, and the circle of great powers was expanding. Britain and France had opened the ironclad age, but by the late 1860s and 1870s they had been joined by Russia, by the newly unified Italy, by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and by a newly unified Germany whose ambitions Bismarck was only just beginning to make explicit. Each nation brought its own strategic requirements, its own industrial capacities, and its own ideas about what a warship should be. And the diversity of solutions they produced was remarkable. The Russians, operating in the shallow waters of the Baltic and the Black Sea, developed heavily armored, low freeboard monitors of limited seakeeping ability but formidable local power. Their circular warships, the Novgorod and the Vice Admiral Popov, designed by the British engineer Edward Reed in a moment that even he later seemed to regard with some ambivalence, were attempts to maximize armor and gun power within the constraints of a hull form that could operate in very shallow water. They were also, by all available accounts, extremely difficult to steer, rotating unpredictably in any kind of current and providing their crews with a nautical experience that was as disorienting as it was novel. They were not, on the whole, considered a success. The Italians, advised by the brilliant and unconventional engineer Benedetto Brin, took the opposite approach, building enormous, fast, ocean-going battleships that prioritized offensive firepower over defensive armor, gambling that speed and hitting power could substitute for the protection that weight of metal would otherwise provide. The Duilio and Caio Duilio of the mid-1870s were, when completed, the most powerfully armed warships in the world, carrying guns so large that the turrets housing them could not be rotated while the ships were moving at speed for fear of capsizing them. They were extraordinary vessels, and almost impossible to operate in any tactically sensible way. The Germans, methodical as ever, built solidly and conservatively, ships that were perhaps less glamorous than the Italian giants or the more revolutionary British designs, but which were engineered with a thoroughness and a reliability that reflected the industrial philosophy of a nation that was, in this period, transforming itself into the most formidable manufacturing power on Earth. And in the background of all of this, two nations that the European powers still largely regarded as peripheral were watching and learning and building. The United States, exhausted by civil war, had largely allowed its navy to decline in the immediate post-war years. A decline so dramatic that by the mid-1870s, Chile's ironclad fleet was considered more powerful than anything the United States could put to sea. But the lesson of Hampton Roads had not been forgotten, and in the 1880s, Congress authorized a program of modern steel warships, the ABCD ships, as they were popularly known, named for their quartet of initial vessels. That began the reconstruction of American naval power with a seriousness of purpose that would bear extraordinary fruit within 2 decades. Japan's transformation was still more dramatic, and in some ways more consequential. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 had set Japan on a course of deliberate, systematic modernization that encompassed every aspect of the state. Its army, its industry, its legal system, its educational institutions, and emphatically its navy. Japanese naval officers were sent to study in Britain and the United States. British engineers were hired to design Japanese warships. The Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, established with French assistance and later expanded with British expertise, became capable of producing vessels that met the standards of any European shipyard. The world discovered just how capable at the Battle of the Yalu River in September 1894, when the Japanese fleet engaged the Chinese Beiyang fleet in the largest naval battle of the Ironclad era in Asian waters. The Japanese victory was not merely tactical, it was a statement, unmistakable and deeply unsettling to the European powers, that the mastery of modern naval technology was no longer a Western monopoly. The age of ironclads had not merely changed the balance of power within Europe, it had begun to change the balance of power within the world. The warship, meanwhile, continued to evolve. The ironclad of the 1860s, still recognizable as a ship, still carrying some vestige of its sailing heritage in its rigging and its hull form, had by the 1890s transformed into something harder to name. Pre-dreadnought was the term that history would eventually settle on, but to contemporaries these were simply battleships, steel-hulled, turret-armed, coal-fired, armored from waterline to main deck in compound plate that no gun of 30 years earlier could have hoped to penetrate. They were the heirs of the Virginia and the Monitor and the Warrior, and they were also, in almost every particular, their complete repudiation. The ironclad had consumed itself in its own evolution, producing something so much more powerful, so much more sophisticated, so much more expensive and complex and lethal, that it bore almost no resemblance to what it had once been. And still the race was not finished. Still the drawing offices burned their lamps late into the night. Still the great powers watched each other across the cold water, measuring, calculating, afraid to stop. The dreadnought was coming, and with it, everything would change again. Every age has a moment when it becomes aware of itself as an age, when it understands, with a clarity that is equal parts pride and melancholy, that what it has built and lived and fought for is not permanent, not universal, but particular to its time, that it is, in other words, passing. For the ironclad era, that moment of self-awareness came gradually, the way dusk comes on a long summer evening. Not suddenly, not with any single dramatic announcement, but through an accumulating softness in the light that makes you realize, eventually, that the day is nearly done. The ships themselves did not disappear overnight. They aged in service, were reassigned to secondary stations, reduced to harbor duties, stripped of their armament and converted to depot ships and coal hulks and accommodation vessels. The great iron warships that had represented the absolute pinnacle of human military technology in their time ended their days, moored quietly in forgotten corners of naval yards, their paintwork fading, their iron sides weeping rust into the water below them. Their names known only to the dockyard workers who occasionally had cause to cross their gangplanks. It was not a glamorous ending, but it was, in its quiet way, a deeply human one. The instrument of the ironclad's supersession arrived on the morning of the 10th of February 1906, when HMS Dreadnought was launched at Portsmouth in the presence of King Edward VII and a considerable portion of the British press. She was, in almost every measurable respect, the most powerful warship ever built, and she had been constructed by the deliberate design of her principal advocate, Admiral Sir John Fisher, in the extraordinary time of 1 year and 1 day, a feat of industrial organization that was intended as much as a message to Britain's rivals as it was a contribution to British naval power. The message was simple. We can do this faster than you can follow. Dreadnought carried 10 12-inch guns in 5 turrets, all of the same caliber, an arrangement that solved in a single stroke the complex and often confused gunnery problems of the pre-dreadnought battleship, whose mixture of heavy, medium and light guns had made accurate long-range fire almost impossibly difficult to coordinate. She was powered not by the reciprocating steam engines that had driven every warship since the ironclad revolution, but by steam turbines, a technology developed by the engineer Charles Parsons that was smoother, faster and more powerful than anything that had come before it. She made 21 knots, the fastest pre-dreadnoughts could manage 18. She rendered every existing battleship in every navy in the world obsolete on the day she was launched, including, and this was the particular irony that Fisher's critics never tired of pointing out, every existing British battleship. The nation that had led the world in naval power for a century had, in its eagerness to leap to the next generation of technology, voluntarily reset the competition to zero. It was the most audacious act of deliberate obsolescence in the history of military technology. And it worked. The ironclad era was over, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The naval arms race that the ironclad had ignited, that restless, compulsive competition between the great powers that had consumed so much treasure and so much engineering genius over half a century, did not end with the dreadnought. It intensified. Britain and Germany entered the 20th century building dreadnoughts against each other with a fervor that alarmed their own finance ministers and delighted their shipyards, each new class of vessel larger and more powerful than the last, the guns growing longer and heavier, the armor thicker, the turbines faster. The Anglo-German naval race of the decade before 1914 was one of the proximate causes of the catastrophe that followed, a contribution to the atmosphere of mutual suspicion and competitive anxiety that made the First World War, when it came, feel to many contemporaries like something that had been building for years, which, in a very real sense, it had. The dreadnoughts themselves, when war finally came in 1914, fought only once in the way that their designers had imagined. The Battle of Jutland in May of 1916, the largest fleet engagement in the history of naval warfare, involving more than 250 warships on both sides, was the apotheosis and the epitaph of the gun-armed capital ship simultaneously. The British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet maneuvered across the grey waters of the North Sea for 2 days in a battle that was tactically inconclusive, strategically decisive, and extraordinarily costly, and which demonstrated with terrible clarity that the warship had finally grown so powerful and the sea so dangerous that neither side could afford the risk of committing its fleet to a decisive engagement again. The German fleet spent the rest of the war in harbour. The British fleet spent the rest of the war ensuring it stayed there, and in the waters above and below the surface, in the deadly geometry of the submarine campaign and the counter-campaign against it. The future of naval warfare was being written in a language that had nothing to do with iron plate and big guns. The ironclad's grandchildren, the dreadnoughts and super-dreadnoughts of the Great War, were already, by 1918, beginning to look like the last expression of an idea that the world was moving beyond. What became of the ships themselves, the original ironclads, the vessels that had started it all? The CSS Virginia never survived the war she had helped to transform. When Union forces advanced on Norfolk in May of 1862, just 2 months after her famous battle with the Monitor, her crew found themselves in possession of a ship that drew too much water to retreat up the James River to Richmond and was too vulnerable, stripped of the harbor's protection, to risk in open water. They ran her aground and burned her, rather than let her fall into Union hands. The most feared warship in the Confederate arsenal ended as a column of smoke visible from the Virginia shoreline, her iron sides cooling in the shallows. Her brief and extraordinary career concluded after barely 3 months of active service. The Monitor fared no better in longevity. She was lost in a storm off Cape Hatteras on the last night of 1862, as already noted, sinking in heavy seas that her low freeboard was never designed to manage. She lay on the bottom of the Atlantic for over a century before being located by researchers in 1973, her famous rotating turret detached and resting upside down on the seabed beside her hull. In 2002, that turret was raised, carefully, painstakingly, over the course of weeks, and conserved at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, where it can be seen today, still massive, still extraordinary, its iron sides pitted and encrusted by 140 years on the ocean floor. But still, unmistakably, itself, HMS Warrior had perhaps the most remarkable afterlife of any ironclad. After her service career ended, she was converted to a floating jetty at Pembroke Dock in Wales, her proud iron hull used as a pontoon. Her identity almost entirely lost, known to the dockyard workers who crossed her daily simply as Oil Jetty C. She was rediscovered in the 1980s by historians who recognized what she was beneath the accumulated indignity of a century of industrial use, and subsequently restored to her 1861 appearance in an 8-year project of extraordinary complexity and dedication. She can be visited today at Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, moored in a pleasing turn of historical symmetry, just a short distance from HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar. The last wooden warship and the first iron one, side by side, separated by 60 years of nautical revolution. And what does it mean? All of it. The battles and the shipyards and the engineers and the pirates and the arms races and the slow fading of iron into rust. It means, perhaps, that the ironclad was the first truly modern weapon system, the first technology in the history of warfare, to change not merely the scale of conflict, but its fundamental nature, and to do so with a speed that outran every institutional, strategic, and philosophical framework built to contain it. It arrived before the world had the language to describe it, before the admiralties had the doctrine to employ it, before the international laws of war had the provisions to govern it. It arrived, and it simply demanded to be dealt with on its own terms by anyone who wished to remain a serious power on the water. In this, it was the ancestor of everything that followed, of the tank and the aircraft carrier and the ballistic missile and the drone. Every weapons technology that arrived faster than the human capacity to understand what it meant and what it required and what it would, ultimately, cost. The ironclad taught the world a lesson that the world has been relearning ever since, that the machine does not wait for the philosophy, that iron moves at its own pace, and the rest of us move to keep up. The wooden warship had lasted 3,000 years. The ironclad lasted, in its pure form, perhaps 40. What replaced it lasted barely 30, before something else came along. The intervals are getting shorter. They have been getting shorter since that grey morning in March of 1862, when a black iron shape came out of the Elizabeth River and changed everything. The water at Hampton Roads is quiet now. Pleasure craft move across it in the summer months. The shoreline has been built up and built over many times since the battle, and most of the people on those boats are not thinking about what happened there, or what it meant, or how much of the world they inhabit was shaped by a handful of engineers and sailors and foundry workers who lived and died in the middle years of the 19th century. But the iron is still there, somewhere below the surface, settling slowly into the silt, patient as the tide. It always was.